This is a Ryobi P411 orbital sander. Now, there's already a couple of Ryobi sanders on the market. This was the P400, the first one that they had. The first dedicated cordless sander that I've ever owned. And actually, this is the second one. These they tend to wear out. Not very expensive, about 20 bucks. Usually, it's sold alone. I've never seen one of these sold as part of one of the toolkits. You can get like the Job Plus, Job Max thing with a little detail sander as part of their Pro kit. And this triangle mouse sander may have been sold as part of one of the really deluxe kits before they were discontinued. And Ryobi just kind of changed gears on what they were selling. But you'll still see these around flea markets and garage sales. It's my second one. You get them for about $5 at a flea market or garage sale. One of the things I was working on, a larger scale project, this thing just wasn't going to cut it. I saw these at the store. This is a P411, and it's heavier duty, it's more money. It's about 40 bucks. It also uses more expensive sanding pads. These tend to be, about $1 each. You can get them for less than that as you buy larger packs. They'll go down to about 46 cents, somewhere in that range, if you buy large enough packs of them. Usually for the type of work I'm doing, I'm buying the 80 grit one, but you can also get 100, 120 grit. 120 grit's pretty good for furniture finishing. Beyond that, you're not really going to be using this type of sander. This is pretty decent. It's okay for flooring work, just realize you're going to run through a lot of pads. It's really excellent for drywall work, I'm finding, because of one of the other features, which is this Sawdust evacuation system that it has. Now, I wasn't taking this too seriously at first, but as I got to using this thing, I realized that this is what makes it a really awesome tool. What happens is there's a bunch of holes in the industry standard on the sandpaper. This stuff is made by Freud Diablo. It's actually made in Switzerland and is sold at Home Depot. So this is common stuff, kind of world market common stuff. It comes with these pre-perforated holes, which when you mount it on the pad, you see will correspond with some holes in the pad. See where this goes. And it's Velcro and it's kind of a wear item, but you go through these holes in a pad, and what that does is that helps it access the impeller action, which works off the same motor that's in the tool to vacuum sawdust partially through this thing and blow it out this way. So you could, in theory, work this with just a discharge hose, but I found that when I mate this with a portable vacuum, this thing's really good for working with high dust materials, such as drywall finishing mud or plaster. Plaster that's used on drywall. And it works very quickly with the 80 grit sandpaper, gets a pretty smooth finish. I thought I was going to have to switch over to 100 grit sandpaper to do the final on the really flat finish stuff. Turns out I really don't need to. The 80 grit's just fine. And this stuff is really good. We're going to show that in a few seconds here. The other cool thing about this, if you're working around materials where something next to what you're working on is something you got to protect, is you have these little rubber pads all around the edge, like a little rubberized skirt that also is at about the same edge as your sandpaper. But when the sandpaper's on it, the sandpaper's a little bit larger than that. That's why the edges can get worn. But if you bump into stuff, it's not going to scratch what you bumped into. I mean, it'll sand it, but it won't scratch it or gouge it, because the mounting of sandpaper works just basically on a Velcro principle. The other thing is that as you're sanding and it's vacuuming to some degree on its own, if you hook it up to a vacuum, you get more vacuum. It's pulling all the stuff away from the surface, so it doesn't gum up the sandpaper. So you can use the sandpaper longer, which you want to do because the pads are more expensive. But even when a pad is kind of worn, a lot of times what happens, the way the pressure is, the way all this works, the center is still relatively fresh. And you could take a pair of scissors out to that if you're trying to be really frugal, and make sanding pads for the little detail sanders that also use a Velcro attachment point. So you can still use these things after that. What I've been doing is on a rough sanding and a big sanding type stuff, I'll use a fresh disc when I really need to ram the edges up on stuff. And then when it gets kind of worn, you can still use these on drywall. You can still use these for flattening down drywall. It works really well, and that's what we're going to show in a demonstration. As for the controls on this, just a basic on and off button. That's it. It oscillates as it spins, so it doesn't spin super hard. If you get your hand on there, you touch it, you expect no damage. Other than that, it's just removal of the battery. That's the only buttons or controls to really know on this type of thing. It is kind of not really a grab it, drop it switch, in that it's a little protected here, so if this falls out of your hand or something, it is going to stay on, and if it bounces on a surface, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn off. On the older model, it worked about the same way. You know, it just that these older ones, this P400, not as powerful. It's really something you would use for a different purpose, which means if you get one of these, you don't necessarily, if you get an orbital, you don't get rid of your others. What you basically do is you start collecting sanders. For jobs where you have to exercise good ethics and what's going to cost your client money, I find that trying to service a more deluxe sander that is a little more onerous to sit there and take scissors and cut out the sandpaper and goof around with all that kind of stuff, versus one that's almost a semi-disposable tool with disposable pads. The thing is it works so much faster, it's worth it. And it's just worth it. You know, it's worth it because I can whip through wiping down a drywall thing so much faster than doing it by hand. Yeah, it gums up the tool. Yeah, it wears out the tool. Yeah, you do need to buy another one at the end of a job. But you know, for what I'm charging hourly on these types of things, it's worth it to save all the time. It's ethical for myself. It's ethical for the client, and definitely something. So let's take a look at this in a demonstration. Here's one of the best ways to have the sander in action. I have it attached to the DeWalt vacuum cleaner because the Ryobi canister vacuum cleaner that uses the Ryobi batteries has been out of production for a long time. And I talk about this in a lot of my other power tool videos, how there's really no single tool system out there which is going to cover everything you need. Although I will say that the Sears Craftsman C3 and the Milwaukee tool systems come pretty close. They didn't really come up in the world when I was equipping, so I ended up going with Ryobi and DeWalt as my tool systems for battery tools. The sander here, using 80 grit sandpaper that had been previously used on the exterior of the house, and what happened on that is it wears out the edges when you're running over rough surfaces. The center tends to be relatively fresh. And sanding between coats to get a really smooth top coat on this, we're going for a smooth finish, extremely fast using it with a power tool. The other thing that happens, you'll see this in a couple of seconds here, when we're sanding and we have these little vent holes on here and it's evacuating dead air, there's a little impeller inside of this thing which pulls the dust and out through this hole. And what you get with the tool, when you buy the tool, is a little dust bag. The thing is, the connection is compatible with the DeWalt vacuum cleaner and the discontinued Ryobi canister vacuum cleaner. It is not compatible with the handheld vacuum cleaners, and interestingly enough, Milwaukee does have a small 12-volt vacuum cleaner that kind of sort of work for this, but I haven't tried it. But it does work pretty well with the DeWalt canister vac. So the way this works, and it's going to be noisy so I can't narrate over it, we turn on the vacuum cleaner first, then turn on a sander. I sand, and I'll go over a couple of surfaces in here. You can see it still kicks dust around, but very little. And that saves us a lot of time on cleanup. relatively small area, though, was done much faster in this than if I were just rubbing it by hand. And I think I'm getting a smoother and better surface using this oscillating orbital sander. But with the onboard vacuum capability that it has, even without the vacuum cleaner, you're good to pull stuff out of this. The vacuum cleaner just helps tremendously. It's not totally dust free. There is some dust that's been coming out of the window, and it's, you know, it's some dust. It's just not horrible the way sanding drywall can turn into a really crappy task. And so that's their closing argument in favor of this little oscillating sander. If you're doing this kind of task, it's kind of an expensive solution to somebody who's just doing homeowner grade stuff, but you know, if you're measuring it against ruined clothes, extra labor, having to hire somebody versus doing it yourself on weekends, I think it's still worthwhile.